Welcome, everybody. We're here to celebrate Haynes Walton Jr., his legacy and his contributions, and to celebrate as well the successful launch of the Haynes Walton Jr. Endowment for the Graduate Study of Racial and Ethnic Politics, which is now supporting its second Walton Scholar this year. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the Director of the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. It is a great honor for all of us here at CPS to host this event and to host our distinguished speaker and all of our guests. And I want to send a special welcome to the emerging scholars who are here as part of the conference in the Political Science Department. I welcome you on behalf of all of us in CPS. To those of us who knew Haynes and knew his work, and especially those who worked with him or were mentored by him, it goes without saying that Haynes was a special person. Let me tell you some facts about it. So he got his undergraduate degree at Morehouse College, got a master's degree at Atlanta University, he got his PhD at Howard University in 1968. Am I right?
67.
Your CV says 68. I'll go with your numbers. Am I right? He was the first
He was the
PhD
first
from Howard
PhD,
University
yeah.
in political science.
Yes.
He held positions at Savannah State College, Atlanta University, and University of Michigan, which he joined in 1992. He was a congressional fellow in the early 1980s in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was a Ford Fellow, a Guggenheim Fellow, and a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow, among many other awards and distinctions. He worked at the Office of Civil Rights Compliance, the Smithsonian Institute, and the United Negro College Fund. He published 21 books. That does not include multiple editions of textbooks. He published 86 articles, not counting book chapters. Haynes cared about many things, as evidenced in his writings, including the fact that he published poetry. And he wrote about literature and writing among African American elites. He even published photography. I knew Haynes from the first day I came to the university in 1993. He was always friendly. He was prone to laughing. He was generous, honest, and informative, and always, always intelligent. I would add one more descriptor. He was an amazing observer of other people, of the human condition. It shows in his work, and it shows in the way that he mentored his students and dealt with his colleagues. Haynes understood people. One rarely comes across a scholar in political science who matches Haynes on the following. He studied deeply elite behavior and the behavior of ordinary people together. He entered into elite behavior and sought to understand how politicians thought, how they acted, how they reacted, and how they wrote. His work on Martin Luther King Jr., on Bill Clinton, on Barack Obama, bears notice and was an attempt to understand the phenomenon of each of these people from an angle very different from the angles used by others. And he understood ordinary people. His study of public opinion, attitudes, behaviors, voting, again, it was deep, connective, contextualizing, and describing other people with precision. Scholars like Haynes leave legacies in their written work and in the institutions that they build or were part of. He has another key legacy. He trained, along with many others here, many scholars who now sit at the very center of the study of race, ethnicity, and black politics. Some are here, and we welcome them. And there are more beyond those here who have given to the fund in his honor, and we appreciate them. Haynes still lives in some ways through these people whom he touched and whom he shaped. They are who they are partly because of him and his approach to work, to life, and scholarship. And again, it goes without saying that we are grateful for him. I now turn the lectern over to Vince Hutchings to introduce our speaker.
Well, hello everyone. I'm honored to be here as well on behalf of my friend, colleague, and mentor, Haynes Walton, and also to introduce my friend and mentor of sorts as well, Paula McLean. There's a lot to be said about Paula in terms of her accomplishments in the discipline. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go over all of them, so I'm just going to hit some of the highlights. And I want you to have an appreciation for her stature before she makes her comments this afternoon, because it's really going to be a sight to behold. Paula is a professor of political science at Duke and has been there since 2000, but she's also currently the dean of the graduate school, and has been in that position since 2012. She has held a range of other important administrative positions as well, and a couple of which I want to highlight here for the moment. One of them, which has been very valuable to the discipline, is her leadership role of the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute. Many of you know about this. Indeed, many of our graduate students, current and past, have come through the program. And that program, housed at Duke University, is something that Paula has kept alive pretty much by sheer force of will. And the importance that that institution has had to the profession is really, I can't say enough about it. In addition to those particular positions, I want to make a few more comments about Dr. McLean before I turn the podium over to her. She received her PhD at Howard University, as was the case with Haynes Walton. It's also the case that Paula is the president-elect of the Midwest Political Science Association.
I'm actually president now.
Oh, I stand corrected. I'm reading from your bio here, but of course.
I didn't update it, yeah.
She's a past president of the National Conference of Political Scientists and a past president of the Southern Political Science Association as well. And in 2014, Paula was elected as a fellow to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And let me just end on a more personal note. I first met Paula actually 20 years ago when she was still at the University of Virginia, the chair of the department.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed out there, and she was extremely gracious and a very nice host. She had the wisdom to offer me the position.
Which you didn't take.
No, I was going to leave that part. So without further ado, Paula McLean.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I guess we don't have, do we have it? No? Okay, well anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. Haynes, as you know, was a very special person, and I am very pleased to be able to be here for this inaugural lecture of Haynes. But before I start, I wanted to... Now, it's not the Nike hat, okay? Because I didn't have one. I had lots of Duke hats in my closet, but didn't have the Nike hat. But I figured that maybe a baseball cap might kind of put us in a Haynes zone so we could kind of think about Haynes and who he was. As you know, and you remember, Haynes used to have nicknames for people. And every time Haynes saw me, he greeted me with a loud shout of my rich cousin, Paula. That was what and it didn't matter where we were or how many people were around, this is what Haynes would yell out. Okay, so I didn't have to figure out, oh, I know, that's Haynes, right? But that was, as you know, that's the kind of person that Haynes was. Very gregarious, giving, generous. And the title of this talk is drawn from numerous influences on Haynes and his intellectual journey and development. I hope by the end of my talk that you'll have more of a detailed and greater understanding of the genius of Haynes Walton, his scholarship, and the shoulders upon which he stood. So many of us stand on Haynes's shoulders, but he was also standing on the shoulders of others. Haynes was interested in so many things in the discipline, so many subfields. And what I want you to understand by the end of this talk is that he had an authoritative voice in many of those subfields that was a result of his own special training. Haynes was not jumping all over the place, but his intellectual development that we're going to walk through really gave him the grounding in these areas. Okay. And of course, Haynes, I should have given him a Duke graduate school hat, okay? But let's juxtapose these two individuals against each other, Ralph Bunche and Haynes Walton. Ralph Bunche was the first black American to receive a PhD in political science from Harvard in 1934, as most of you already know. And so all of the succeeding generations of black political scientists stem from Bunche. And as such, Bunche represents that first generation of black political scientists in the United States, and his influence on the discipline and his training of other black political scientists have left its mark on modern day political science. But Haynes is one of the select few that really had a direct connection to Bunche through the faculty that taught him as an undergraduate and a master's student, and particularly for his doctoral work at Howard. It dawned on me as to why, in fact, we may see 77 or 78 on Haynes, because the CVI has says 77, is I put down 67. I put down 77 for my PhD from Howard because I defended in July. My transcript says December of 77. But Howard puts you in the next class when they have a commencement. Okay, so Howard carries me as a 78 PhD, probably carries Haynes as a 68 PhD. So people may accuse me of lying, right, on my thing, but I know what my transcript says. And so I use 77. By the Brown decision of 1954, there were 21 black Americans with PhDs in political science in the United States. And this, of course, includes Bunche. And this was a very small and tightly knit group. 3 of those 21 were Michigan PhDs. William Madison Boyd, he had to finish sometime after 46, because there's this wonderful book that I discovered that I'll talk a little bit about. Robert Gill, 1942, who made his career at Morgan State. William Madison Boyd made his career at Atlanta University. He died before Haynes actually went to Atlanta University. And Thomas Solomon, 1939, who made his career at Prairie View A&M University. When Haynes entered Morehouse College, he came in contact with and was mentored by Robert Brisbane. Brisbane was a Harvard PhD for 1949. Brisbane organized the political science department at at Morehouse College, served as its chair from 65 to 85, was a professor of political science at Morehouse College from 49 to 85, and his research was in black activism. He published 2 very influential books, The Black Vanguard, Origins of the Negro Social Movement, 1900 to 1960, and Black Activism, Racial Revolution in the United States, 1954 to 1970. But Brisbane was also a Fulbright scholar in India. And Brisbane introduced a number of courses in with a comparative focus that Haynes appears to really have liked, because in Haynes's junior year at Morehouse, Brisbane established a series of non-Western courses in the Atlanta University Center and piqued Haynes's interest in international relations, affairs, and Africa. After graduating from Morehouse in '63, Haynes enters the Masters of Arts of Political Science program at Atlanta University. Now, just a little history. The Atlanta University Center consisted of Morehouse, Spelman, Clark at the time, Morris Brown, that is no longer there, and Atlanta University. And they were all a part of the Atlanta University Center, DuBois made his career, a good part of his career, at Atlanta University and edited the journal Phylon during that time that he was there. But Atlanta University was the all graduate degrees, the master's degrees that existed in the various disciplines in the Atlanta University Center. So that Haynes had most likely already taken some courses at the other institutions in the Atlanta University Center. And so moving from Morehouse into a master's program at Atlanta University was not a difficult transition for him because he would have been familiar with the faculty and everybody there. When he entered Atlanta University, he came in contact with Samuel DuBois Cook. Sam Cook became his mentor and guided Haynes in many ways through a number of levels of his career. Now, Sam finished his PhD at Ohio State in '54. A thing I want to mention and to remind you, because my mentor and urban geographer, Harold Rose, also got his PhD from Ohio State in '51 or '52. Many of you certainly will not remember, and maybe a few of you know, that what Southern states were doing to keep blacks from trying to challenge the admission processes of the graduate schools in the states, they were giving scholarships for blacks to go outside of their state to get graduate education so the state wouldn't have to deal with that. My mentor was from Tennessee, went to Ohio State. Sam Cook was from Georgia, went to Ohio State. Sam introduced Haynes to V.O. Key in Southern politics, and Cook and Haynes writes in a preface to Liberian Politics that Cook indicated to his students that the socializing import of the segregationist ideology of the South and the North had poisoned the very wellspring of American democracy. Now, given the small faculty at Atlanta University, the center, and the various schools that fed into that, faculty had to teach across various subfields. So that Sam Cook, who when he came to Duke as the first black tenured faculty person at Duke in '66, was an Americanist and taught American politics. But when he was at Atlanta University, he also taught international relations, foreign policy, and political philosophy. Somewhere along the line in his Morehouse and Atlanta University careers, Haynes developed a strong interest in regulation and bureaucracy. This is the front page of Haynes's master's thesis. Haynes wrote his master's thesis on the regulation of political broadcasting in the United States. Who knew, right, that instead of black politics for his master's thesis, Haynes is interested in regulating public broadcasting or broadcasting, political broadcasting. Now remember, we'd had the 1960 Nixon-Kennedy debates, right? For Haynes, somehow this piqued an interest as to what the government was doing or was going to do about the regulation of broadcasting for political broadcasting in the United States. Now, Haynes comes back to the regulation and bureaucracy issues and themes at various points in his career, but he kind of starts from there and moves in a different direction. In '64, Haynes enters the new PhD program in government, then changed to political science at Howard University. Now, he was not just entering any university or department, but one with a history unlike any other university or historically black college or university in the country. This was also the first time that Haynes would have encountered faculty that specialized in specific subfields, that had the luxury of not having to teach across areas, but could teach in the areas in which they were trained. He also arrives in a department that was founded, structured, and basically staffed by Ralph Johnson Bunch. Bunch arrives at Howard in 1929 at the grand old age of 26. Having finished his master's degree at Harvard, he was a UCLA undergraduate. Mordecai Wyatt Johnson was the first black president of Howard. He got Bunch to come to Howard to basically say, gave him the mandate, is I want you to develop this department. Now, Bunch continued to work on his PhD during the summers and finished his PhD in 1934. And he remained chair of the department until 1941 when he left for government service during World War II for the OSS, and then moved on to the United Nations. But Bunch was an intellectual force on campus. And many of those scholars that were part of what Charles Henry calls the Howard School of Thought were still in residence when Haynes arrived. During Bunch's time, and up until the late 1960s, blacks that earned doctorates in any discipline could only find positions at historically black institutions, with Howard at the top of the pyramid. John Hope Franklin, who I dearly miss, who ended his career at Duke, basically would say about Howard is that for a black intellectual, Howard was as high as you could go. In fact, what John Hope used to say, it was the end of the road, which means at any given point in time, Howard had on its faculty some of the top black scholars in the country, many names of which you will know. Of course, there was Ralph Bunch, the philosopher Elaine Locke, the historian Rayford W. Logan, the poet Sterling Brown, the mathematician Kelly Miller, the historian Carter G. Woodson, the historian John Hope Franklin, the divinity Charles H. Wesley, the lawyer Charles Hamilton Houston, who argued the Brown case, William Leo Hansberry, who was in the English department. He was the uncle of Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote Raisin in the Sun and was one of her influences. Ernest Everett Just, who was a biologist. E. Franklin Frazier, the sociologist. Eric Williams, the economist. Abram Davis, the economy. I think Abram Davis was a sociologist. John Davis, who was an economist. Dorothy Porter, Merz Cook, who was a political scientist, and others I could name, but the list goes on and on. This was a phenomenal collection of minds. Now, Bunch was gone by the time that Haynes came to Howard, but many of these people were still there and taught courses. And Bunch also hired Emmett Edward Dorsey as an instructor in political science in the late 20s or early 30s. It was a little difficult for me to find the exact date. But Dorsey became Haynes's mentor and chaired his dissertation. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Now, Bunch, of course, you know, was an extraordinary human being. His commitment to human rights, his remarkable work in building of the United Nations, working for peace in the Middle East, pushing for decolonization of Africa, it goes on and on. And given these many accomplishments, Bunch's name is usually synonymous with diplomacy and international relations. But before he did all that, Bunch was an academic. He was a scholar. And many scholars of scholars identify Bunch's scholarship as basically the early development of what was then called Negro politics, which we now call black politics. As a young instructor, Now let me show you what is going on here. I was trying to find a picture of Emmett Dorsey. For someone who you hear so much about, finding information about him was extremely difficult. This is a picture from a 1932 conference on the social sciences that Bunch organized at Howard. And if you look in the front row, the third person in, going to your right, is Ralph Bunch. The very tall gentleman standing next to him is Emmett Dorsey. And then the very short one is W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay? There are more people in here of that stature, okay? But this is to just kind of give you a sense of what Bunch was doing and what political science was at Howard, and Emmett Dorsey, who became Haynes's dissertation advisor. This is another thing. The reason why I knew this one, the middle one, was Dorsey, was I did find a legend for this particular picture. This was the Amenia conference that was held for black scholars at Joel Spingarn's estate up in New York called Amenia. And this is Bunch on the very end. To the right, again, Du Bois. But if you go down in the very back, you see the tall guy with the wavy hair. That was listed as Emmett Edward Dorsey, so I knew the other guy in the picture was Dorsey. Now, Haynes's work is very much in the vein of Bunch. And I'm going to read you a quotation from a letter that Bunch wrote to George Arthur of the Julius Rosenwald Foundation in 1932, when Bunch was working on his dissertation on French colonialism. And I want you to see if you do not recognize Haynes and his approach in this section of the letter. Bunch says, "The French books on colonial administration, and they are legion, are rather frothy, highly emotional, spirited, some of them critical, but few of them really based on intelligent, painstaking, detached, and scholarly research. My way becomes more clear to me each day. I must primarily devote myself to running down the cold facts and figures and conduct an entirely original analysis of conditions quite objectively." If you think about a lot of Haynes's work, the painstaking detail, the digging out of data that no one else has found, you really see this connection where the way Bunch trained his students was the way his students trained Haynes. Now, at the time Haynes entered this new program, this was the first PhD program in political science at a historically black university. History and political science were approved at the same time by the Board of Trustees to offer the PhD in the early 1960s. And the PhD was structured in such a way that they realized that they had to have a very rigorous and high-quality program so that the holders of these degrees would not and could not be dismissed. So Haynes mentions in another preface to one of his books about how he had to take exams in 5 subfields of political science. What I've been able to glean, because of course I couldn't get a transcript, I'm sure mine and Haynes's have all disappeared and have not been digitized. But what I've been able to put together based on some of the things that I've read is that clearly one of his fields was Negro politics, black politics, international relations, African politics, political theory, and I assume American politics bureaucracy. Now, when I came through, the department had lightened up a bit. They reduced the exams from 5 to 4. But it was still a tough hurdle. And these were what we used to call lock-up exams, right? They put you in a room for 8 hours with notebook paper, gave you the exam, and told you to write. And you know, at that time, they actually failed people. You know, I don't think we're doing that now as much as we did in the past. And I actually strategized in terms of when I was going to take my exams. I always wanted to kind of see who I was going to take my exams with and whether or not I could shine in that group. If not, I would delay. But it was so strategy, 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 you know. But Haynes thrived in this environment. And Emmett Dorsey really helped him kind of develop his base. Now, Dorsey was a political theorist. Oh, and I've kind of told you all of that. I'm sorry, I didn't. I was supposed to shift the slide. But Dorsey was writing about Negro politics and government, and found a very nice article in The Crisis from October '61 where he talks about and goes through in very, very detail about these things. But Haynes's dissertation became, and I apologize for the cover, I just couldn't find any crisp covers. This, The Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., was his dissertation. It was not his first book. His first book was on third-party Negroes and third-party politics, okay, which came out in like '69 or something. But he dedicates this book, Political Theory, to Emmett Dorsey. And this is, when you think about Sam Cooke, Morehouse, when Sam Cooke went to Morehouse, he was a classmate of Martin Luther King. He comes to Howard, Dorsey becomes his mentor. He kind of thinks back and reflects on what Sam Cooke had talked about in terms of Martin Luther King. He does this dissertation with Dorsey on the political philosophy, and it's not a history, right? He's dealing with various concepts from, I hated political theory. I'm sorry. I apologize to the theorists, but I think that was my worst exam. You know, I was just glad to get a pass. I didn't want to know where it fell, okay? Because I just had some difficulty with that area. But Haynes seemed to really glom onto it. And it shows in this particular book. So he's got Emmett Dorsey. Also at Howard at this time is Rayford W. Logan. Now, I talked to you about Logan, and if you know, Logan kind of anchors, not only was he an historian, but when W.E.B. Du Bois was holding his Pan-African Congresses in the early 1920s, Rayford W. Logan was the secretary. Okay, he finished Williams in 1917, goes to Paris, does all of these things, and then comes back to Howard, joining the faculty in 1938, and retires in '65, but Rayford Logan was still there. Okay, he was still in Douglas Hall. And this is one of these things where you see the connections, even though Logan was in history, the fact that both of these departments got their PhD degrees at the same time. Political science was on the first floor of Frederick Douglass Hall. History was on the second floor of Frederick Douglass Hall. And there was all of this interaction between the faculty and among the graduate students, okay? So it is highly likely, when you look at some of the historical aspects of Haynes's work, that Haynes actually took classes with Logan. This is an incredible woman that's been lost to our discipline. This is Maris Tate. She was the first black woman to receive a PhD in political science from Harvard, then Radcliffe College, in 1941. She was the first black woman to receive a degree from Oxford. There's this great book, I recommend it to you, but it's called Holders of Doctorates Among American Negroes, an educational and social study of Negroes who have earned doctoral degrees in course 1876 to 1943. It's by Harry W. Green. He correctly identifies Maris Tate as the first black woman to get a PhD in political science. Over the years, the discipline kind of lost Maris Tate, and maybe it was because she made a career in a history department at Howard with a connection to political science. And so somehow we forgot her. But her work, which was manifest, was in diplomatic history. Okay, and it's highly probable when you look at Haynes's book on Liberian politics, which was published in 2002. It's called Liberian Politics, A Portrait by African-American diplomat J. Milton Turner, where he looks at diplomatic cables, diaries, and other primary sources to develop a portrait of J. Milton Turner. This is in the vein of the work that Mers Tate did. There is a new book. I have not read it yet, but it just came out in October by Cornell Press. It's called White World Order, Black Power Politics. The author, Robert Vitalis, makes the argument that racism and imperialism affected the way international relations was taught in the United States. And he uses this book, and what he says is he recovers the arguments, text, and institutional building of an extraordinary group of professors at Howard, including Elaine Locke, Ralph Bunche, Rayford W. Logan, Eric Williams, and Mers Tate, who developed a particular view on international relations that went against the dominant view. Haynes would have been influenced by Mers Tate, and with her just being up on the second floor and having to walk down the stairs to get out the building, I'm sure that Haynes encountered her. This slide is something that very few people know about the influence on Haynes. We all know who Harold Gosnell was. He was a student of Charles Merriam. We see him as one of the developers of what we know as kind of quantitative analysis in political science. We only associate him with the University of Chicago. He was at Chicago from 22 to 41 when he came to Washington, D.C. to work in the government. In 1961, he joins the faculty of the Department of Political Science at Howard University. And he's there until he retires. When Haynes arrives, he is assigned to Gosnell as Gosnell's research assistant. And Haynes says, in a preface, and if you read the preface of Haynes's book, he thanks Gosnell a lot. In the book in the preface to Presidential Elections 1789 to 2008 with Don Deskins and Sherman Puckett, Haynes says this: Gosnell taught him, but parentheses me, about the relevancy of political statistics from aggregate election return data in grasping insights and empirically based on findings about the behavior of American political parties, both in the past and the present. Gosnell was on his dissertation committee and served as another mentor with Emmett Dorsey for the kind of work that Haynes did. Vincent Brown was a student of Bunche's. He got his BA at Howard. Bunche sent him to Harvard. Vincent Brown says in an oral history tape that was done by the APSA that he believes that it was only because of Bunche that he got into Harvard, that Bunche recommended him, Bunche wrote a letter for him, and so Bunche sent him to Harvard. He then, after World War II, came back to Howard, and he taught budgeting, public administration, bureaucracy. This is one of my favorite books, When the Marching Stopped, which when I read it, I could kind of see and hear Vince Brown's voices, as well as Ralph Bunche. Because Brown used to always talk about Bunche and what he expected and then what Brown expected and what we were supposed to do with our careers and our lives and how we were supposed to be top flight scholars. And so if I heard it when I came through, I know Haynes heard it when he came through. This book is a continuation of Haynes's early regulation and bureaucracy work. And like I said, I really think it's one of my favorites. At the time it was published in 1988, it represented a refreshing and new approach to the policy implementation literature. It's a comprehensive and detailed analysis of the implementation of Title VI, discrimination in programs receiving federal funds, and Title VII, employment discrimination of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I'm not kidding you, across all of the statutory and executive agencies of the federal government from 1964 to 1982. Quintessential Haines. Deep dive into data and records and archives to find information that no one else has found. Robert Martin, another Bunch student. Martin got his master's degree, his BA and his master's at Howard, then started teaching, as many black scholars did after they got their masters. They started teaching at HBCUs. He then went to the University of Chicago, finished his degree in '47, and came back to Howard to teach. Both Martin and Brown were in residence when I was there. I took classes with them, so I know that Haines was on that same trajectory and was influenced by people who had directly been influenced by Bunch. One of the things that I find really interesting in terms of connecting is that there is this little article in the Journal of Negro Education in 1963 that's published by Harold Gosnell and Robert E. Martin on the Negro as voter and office holder. So these individuals were working with each other, and then these individuals were working with Haines. This was published before Haines entered. Invisible Politics. Like I said, When the Marching Stopped was probably one of my favorite books. I think one of the most influential books of Haines's was Invisible Politics, which was published in 1985. I'm struck by how much of the criticisms Haines made at that point in '85 are things that we take for granted now in our research on black political behavior. What I mean is that many of the weaknesses that Haines identified in the behavioral research on black politics and political behavior are things that are now done routinely, or things that we assume we know should be taken into account. Haines argues in the preface that the politics of black America has been invisible. In the political science literature, and again from Haines, he draws on the work of Samuel Du Bois Cook, W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and of course Ralph Ellison, for whom invisibility is the center part of the invisible man. What Haines means by invisibility is that the factors that contribute to the political behavior of blacks are not only the individual variables that are at the core of behavioral approaches, but the structural factors that are often excluded from our analysis. Now, as you know, Haines would not have been an uninformed critic of the behavioral movement. I mean, a lot of people, unfortunately, will make comments about, well, Haines is, wasn't behavioral, but he was. In a very pure Gosnellian sense, he was an empiricist. Haines argues in Invisible Politics that most of the studies on black political behavior ignore systemic external influences, identify individual black pathologies and black deviation from the norm as the crux of the problem. In many ways, and I've got a lot more written here, but I don't want to go too long. Like Haines's work in Invisible Politics, like all of Haines's work, Invisible Politics is a study in a massive review of existing literature at the time. Haines covers the literature not only on voting behavior, but political culture, political socialization, public opinion, political parties, legislative behavior, judicial behavior, political leadership, and international political behavior, all of which he ties to the behavior and fortunes of black America. Again, Haines was not opposed to behavioral approaches to the study of black politics. He just was concerned that those who focused exclusively on this approach neglected to take into account other factors that affected black political behavior. Now, one of the things, and I have to tell you this because I don't want to go on too long, one of the things he did for Invisible Politics is Haynes collected survey data. He developed the questionnaire. He called this survey the National Black Survey. He located key sampling units and began interviewing. The interviews took place in stages from 1972 to 1974. Now, Haynes was not using a caddy system or all the things that we do now or the internet. Haynes was doing this himself, and you can kind of envision Haynes in that little sports car driving from primary sampling unit to primary sampling unit to give out these questionnaires. He had a sample of 1,200 persons were planned, but he says due to dwindling resources, only 1,100 questionnaires were administered. He had a 91.2% response rate and only had 8.8 of the questionnaires that were unusable. Now, Haynes is not clear in his write-up how the survey data were collected, but as I said, you can assume that it was Haynes, right? Driving around collecting these data. And since he was at Savannah State, you can also envision or see Haynes hand calculating all 1,100 questionnaires and constructing the tables that are spread throughout the chapters of this book by hand. The significance of Haynes's work is just manifest. I mean, who does that but Haynes Walton, right? Who thinks these questions are so important that the labor involved to collect those data should have been put into that project? And if I had to choose an overarching contribution of Haynes, which are many, but I really had to kind of put it in the sense that Ralph Bunche was the beginning of Negro politics, and Haynes Walton redefined how we thought about the politics of Black America. That he moved us beyond that politics was just voting, that there was so much more to the political process. Haynes was very much a product of the intellectual environment that he experienced. From Morehouse to Atlanta University to Howard University. He was a mentor to so many and supported the careers of many of us, including me. And his work with Robert Smith, another one of our Howard University graduates, he was between Haynes and me. Robert was probably, I think he was like a year ahead of me, maybe a year and a half ahead of me. He had done his undergraduate work at UCLA. We'd done a master's at UCLA and came to Howard to do his PhD. His work, Haynes's and Robert's work with this text, American Politics and the African American Quest for Universal Freedom, opened the field of Black politics to several generations of undergraduates through their successful texts. They have gotten to students who probably would not have been able to read some of the literature that we read for our research. Haynes pushed boundaries and pushed the entire discipline to take seriously the politics of Black America. Those of us who knew him, and those of you who did not know him but benefited directly from what he did, almost probably, although most probably do not realize it, will forever be grateful. Thank you very much for allowing me to share this wonderful event with you and to talk about Haynes Walton. Thank you.